Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue as we get ready to set the stage for the final official visit weekend of Penn State's really busy June here on campus. It's the fourth consecutive weekend in which the Nittany Lions will host recruits from within the region, from beyond the region, with an opportunity to work towards building out their 2025 recruiting class, which took another step forward this week. Wednesday evening, another commitment came through in the defensive backfield, this one out of South Florida. We're going to break that down with Tyler Calvaruso in just a moment before looking ahead to the next wave of official visitors and talking about Friday camp action coming to Happy Valley as Penn State wraps up its June prospect events. But I want to tease a little bit. If you stick around after Tyler, we're going to have a conversation about one of the new squads here in the Big Ten and one of the new squads on Penn State's 2024 schedule. Southern Cal, the USC Trojans, obviously one of the more storied programs in college football history. Year 3 under Lincoln Riley. A lot of expectations haven't really been met despite the presence of a number 1 overall quarterback pick in Caleb Williams the last couple of years. We'll break down where USC is coming into the Big Ten, and we'll start to look ahead toward a mid-October matchup out in Los Angeles that, in my opinion, when you look at Penn State's schedule, the way it lays out, really feels like a launch pad point for how the second half of their schedule plays out with some of those matchups. Meanwhile, as you'll get to, USC has a heck of a start to this season on their schedule before they get to the Nittany Lions. Also want to mention we have some breaking news regarding an injury on the roster. Zariah Fisher, a defensive end with the program, redshirt senior, will be out an indefinite period of time following an injury that was suffered during spring ball. This was first reported on Thursday by our old pal Sean Fitz. We were able to confirm that report, and ultimately that's Zariah Fisher. Again, we're going to have to wait and see when he can get back, but this is a second serious injury for Fisher in a 3-year span. Remember, he missed most of the 2022 season with an early year injury, came back last year, became a key rotational piece at the defensive end spot. And it's an area where you lost 2 starters in Adiza Isaac and Chop Robinson. So there was certainly some thought that Zariah Fisher had an opportunity to take another step forward. He had a really strong winter conditioning program. There was some buzz about this guy early in the year, but unfortunately, that news to pass along that Zariah Fisher ruled out indefinitely, along with linebacker Keon Wiley, quarterback Jackson Smolik. Those are some of the names that we have been told in recent months that we're going to have to monitor regarding injury situations. So with that all said, and by the way, Daniel Gallen over at Lions 24/7 has a full write-up today on Thursday about where Penn State's going to be looking now at defensive end with this injury news and the other pieces involved with that rotation. So check that out, lions247.com. But as I said, a ton to get to in the recruiting world. We'll do that right now with Tyler Calvaruso. Tyler, thanks for bearing with me. Had a few things to sneak into that intro as the Fisher news popped here just as we were getting set to record. Wanted to address that at the top, but we got big news to go with you, and that's the addition of Antonio Branch, big time addition for Penn State out of Miami. Spent some time on campus recently, came away really impressed by the program, and ultimately he does join this class. Let's dive into it. Antonio Branch, Penn State. Why did this marriage happen?
First safety of the cycle on board for Anthony Poindexter and Penn State. He's a player that Penn State really likes the upside with in kind of a multitude of ways, given the versatility that he adds. So going back to the spring, Branch was going to visit for the blue-white game. It didn't happen. Staff got down to Florida to see him during the spring contact period. That visit went really, really well. That visit occurred after Branch had already made it to Nebraska for an official. It looked like the Huskers were maybe a little bit of the favorite coming out of that visit, but Branch makes it to Penn State for his official visit during the first visit weekend of the summer, and really Penn State was the leader for him from that point on. He was set to make it to Louisville this upcoming weekend for an official, decided to scrap that. He felt State College was the place for him. I remember going back to when Branch popped, not when Branch first popped onto the radar, but when we were discussing the first official visit weekend, how maybe we want to see what will come with Branch's potential official visit to Florida. That trip didn't happen either. So Penn State was able to get this one done in, really a fashion that it wanted to. It wanted to get Branch on board into its safety room. He's a versatile guy, can give you value as a cover safety. He can play corner if needed. He's good coming downhill. So there's a lot to like about this get if you're the Nittany Lions. And I think one thing I would say about Antonio Branch is he might not have the notoriety of some of the other safety targets that we've discussed throughout the cycle. But the fact that Penn State is willing to welcome him on board at this juncture of the cycle, while some other names and targets who are still available for the taking, they're out there. And I think it speaks volumes about what Penn State thinks about Branch and what he could bring to the safety depth chart.
You and I have some other safety targets to discuss on Penn State's board a little bit later here in the episode. But looking at Branch, listed at 6'2", 172 pounds at 24/7 Sports, the number 37 safety nationally. He's a high 3-star with an 89 rating. You look at his composite ranking, he's the 35 safety nationally, number 439 overall on the industry consensus in the recruiting world. And so to be able to pull a guy, I mean, this isn't necessarily foreign territory. We saw Penn State go pluck a couple cornerbacks last cycle out of the state of Florida, and Antoine Belgrave-Shorter and John Mitchell. The cycle before that, King Mack made the move up from South Florida. He was looking like a promising figure for the future of this program before he hit the portal, ended up at Alabama this offseason. With Antonio Branch, where did that comfort level come from, what you gathered, and why was this ultimately a move that he was willing to make at this stage?
Relationships were big for him. Really like Anthony Poindexter, but I think the key relationship in this recruitment was his relationship with Jaywan Sider. Those two, and Sider, his work in Florida on the recruiting trail, every Penn State fan knows what he does in the Sunshine State at this point, and that showed through again in this recruitment. Those two became really, really close. Branch, whenever he would talk about Penn State, Sider would come up in conversation. So even though he's not going to be working directly with him at the next level, Jaywan Sider is a presence in Happy Valley that Branch is comfortable with. The relationship with Poindexter was where it needed to be. I think Tom Allen got really involved once he took over as defensive coordinator. That relationship came along nicely. When Penn State visited Branch at his high school during the spring contact period, I think that started to get kind of the wheels in motion of the Nittany Lions becoming his leader, because the feedback from that visit was just really, really overwhelmingly positive. Both sides hit it off. Branch was very comfortable being around the staff, being around Allen, learning more about his defense and how he would fit at safety. So the relationships were really, really big here for Penn State. Another thing I would say is geography. Branch growing up in Miami, he likes that State College is, as he put it, a little bit out of the way. He said that was kind of his thing. He just wants to focus on football and not all the hustle and bustle of being in a big city. So I think those two factors played a really key part in this one coming together for Penn State.
Another bigger, longer frame for Penn State to work with. More longer than bigger right now at this stage of his career, but Branch certainly has that room to grow. We know that Anthony Poindexter was a former large frame safety of the All-American variety back at Virginia, and he's found a way to really piece together some interesting body makeups within the safety room. You look at the two guys that they brought in this year as true freshmen, Babu Torre, really a lot to like about the skills that he's going to bring you as a guy who's going to mow you down a little bit. And then of course, bringing Lamont Payne over from the cornerback position. This is another longer guy. I think last year we were observing that he was maybe the longest body in that cornerback room. And lo and behold, he ends up in Penn State safety room in year 2. And we've seen other guys make that transition in the past. Zaki Wheatley, Keaton Ellis, it's worked out for others at different times. So the safety room is starting to stock that up a little bit. We know who the names are right now, but it also feels like the cornerback room last offseason could happen for the safety room this offseason, where Jalen Reed, KJ Winston, and Zaki Wheatley, if they come through and have the kind of year that people expect them to on campus, that they may be moving on to the NFL this offseason. So all of a sudden, there's a lot of attention on who else is coming and going. And so where else is Penn State looking at the safety spot? I know I'm kind of getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here because we have some official visitors on campus, but it's not a very long list at this stage anymore, is it?
It's not. It's really 3 guys that we're focusing on, 2 of which are going to be on campus this weekend. Jadon Blair is the big one, top 24/7 safety from North Carolina. I mean, he's a really big kid. We talk about guys who fit the mold of what Poindexter looks for physically. Blair, he's that. I mean, he might grow beyond safety if we're being honest. We're going to have to see where that takes him. But he's the big one on the board right now. Been a top target for Poindexter and the staff for an extended period of time. Fact of the matter is Penn State has some ground to make up with him during the official visit. Notre Dame has done a really good job with Blair. Mike Mickens, the new DB's coach there. He's done a great job. Michigan did a good job with Blair during his official visit last weekend. Blair's coming off an official visit to Florida State. But when I evaluate this recruitment where Penn State stands, they're going to have to overcome Michigan, Notre Dame, and the progress those 2 programs have made. Do I think that's possible? I do. The relationship with Poindexter is good. Blair's father has a really strong relationship with multiple members of Penn State's coaching staff, the support staff. So there's a lot of trust in State College, but it's going to be the biggest visit of the weekend, no doubt about it. Beyond Blair's Braswell Thomas, New Jersey standout, who really has popped onto the radar here this month, given what he accomplished on the camp circuit, impressed the staff with his testing numbers and his elite showcase camp performance, locked in an official visit for this weekend. We're going to have to see how that one goes, but it's sounding pretty good for Penn State right now with Braswell Thomas. And then there's Rashad Johnson, the 4-star from Florida who took an official visit a couple of weekends ago now. Penn State was his number one coming out of the visit. Staff did a really good job with him while he was on campus, but he makes it to Georgia last weekend. That trip goes really, really well. Georgia still has some of its top safety targets available for the taking, but for what we've gathered, Johnson would have a place in Athens, so that's noteworthy. And he's going to be at Texas A&M this weekend too. So 2 SEC programs, Texas A&M always competitive on the NIL front. Georgia, I think that pretty much sells itself at this point. But Penn State has acquitted itself with Johnson quite well, I would say. Really, it's a matter of weathering the storm of those 2 SEC programs.
And I'll note, I didn't mention him, but Danton Lynn got to campus just a couple of weeks ago. 6'2", over 200 pounds already as a freshman out of Baltimore, someone who's a 4-star talent. So a lot to like about what Anthony Poindexter has in place, and those pursuits will continue through this weekend and beyond as they look to maybe create a safety tandem there with one guy on board and with Branch and find the complementary piece for him. Tyler, 3 commitments in the last 10 days, all of them impacting Penn State's future in the defensive backfield. Terry Smith, Anthony Poindexter doing their work. As we discussed the last episode of this podcast, Jameer Joseph jumped on board earlier this week out of St. Joe's Regional in Montvale, New Jersey. He's a 4-star, top 24/7 cornerback. And then 1 week prior, back on June 10th, coming off an official visit to Penn State, Darius Dixon from Mater Dei High School out in Southern California joined this class at the cornerback spot. Another top 24/7 guy. In fact, a top 100 player. So the talent acquisition seems to be in a very good place. But as you addressed at safety, it's not quite done yet. Where else are we looking in the defensive backfield? Because this is kind of on fire right now for Penn State.
Yeah, we really touched on all of the guys at safety, and at corner, the conversation centers around Brandon Finny, the top 24/7 standout from McDonough in Maryland. It's just he's inching closer to a decision. And when you look at his recruitment, the way things have played out, Penn State has essentially been there from the start of his blow-up. The relationship with Terry Smith is really, really good. His official visit went really, really well in favor of the Nittany Lions. Made it to South Carolina the following weekend, was at Ohio State last weekend, will be at Oregon this weekend. There are a lot of people who feel good about Penn State's place in this recruitment. So I think Finny, there's a chance that he could be the latest standout corner to join Penn State's secondary. Now, we're going to have to see how that Oregon visit plays out. In Ohio State, Buckeyes, they did well with Finny by all accounts, but Penn State seemingly – they're generating the most buzz right now.
It's remarkable. It seems like Penn State could really do a lot of the heavy lifting for their defensive back class here in just like a 2 to 3 week span in June, and then really be good to go working their way toward December. Maybe there's some other pieces, but this commitment yesterday puts Penn State at 16 total players in their 2025 class. We're working our way, still 6 months out from that early signing period in December. But Tyler, fair to say that we're essentially at the 2/3 mark of this roster filling up right now. We'll see what the exact number is that they end up with on signing day for prospects. But what are the priorities? We're going to get to some potential crystal ball watch guys in just a second. But when you look at positional needs, I guess you can probably cross cornerback and safety off that list maybe within the next few weeks. But where else is Penn State looking? We spent so much time talking about the defensive backfield. What are the remaining priorities?
Defensive line, for sure. That's a place Penn State has yet to strike. Well, that's not necessarily true, because Deshaun Burnett could easily be an edge rusher for the Nittany Lions at the next level.
He sure looked like he could be.
Yeah,
we got eyes on him a couple weeks ago. Yeah,
I think he's going to be an edge for Penn State when it's all said and done. That's something that continuously comes up in the plan. So let me rephrase that. The Nittany Lions have yet to land the defensive lineman during official visit season. And they are in a good spot with some guys. Max Granville, top 24/7 target. Deion Barnes, top target on the edge right now. Cedric Works is a top 100 prospect from Ohio who has Penn State high on his list. He's still going through his official visit schedule. He's going to be at Kentucky this weekend. On the interior, you've got guys like Jarquez Carter, has already taken an official visit. Yvonne Camacho has already taken an official visit. Randy Adarica is coming off an official visit. So defensive line's a point of emphasis. Linebacker, Tom Allen would probably like to go out and get another if it works. Again, you're not going to overextend and take a guy just for the sake of taking a guy. But if Penn State could find a fit at linebacker, there's definitely the potential for one more addition at the position. And then offensively, you're set at quarterback, running back. You've got the trio on board. Those guys have been talked about really in depth throughout the cycle. Wide receiver is still a position of need, and Penn State's going pretty hard after that. Tight end, if you could get another guy, and when we say that, we're really talking about Andrew Olis, a top 100 in-state standout. If you could get another guy to pair with Matt Henderson, that would be good. Penn State's been chipping away at 2 tight ends in this class, the potential for that for a while now. Olis should be a good fit. And on the offensive line, things have definitely changed there over the last week. The board has shrunk with some top targets going off the board elsewhere, but Phil Trotwine is going after guys who are still available. And another situation where you're not going to add a guy just for the sake of adding a guy, but if the right prospect is out there and things go well, Penn State, definitely in a position to add another lineman. You got to remember, top 24/7 target Malachi Goodman, still out there. Penn State loves him. He's been a top target for a long time now.
Speaking of adding guys, we're going to put you on the hot seat now. And you already kind of put yourself on that hot seat because you wrote up a piece this week about the crystal ball watch list. Now, this came after Jameer Johnson's commitment. So Antonio Branch would have been the correct answer to your question, who could be next to commit to Penn State's class. But we'll put him to the side for now. And I asked you to bring 3 of those names to this conversation on the podcast. And you're going all 3 in the same position room. This should be music to the ears of our listeners. Tell us why you're feeling optimistic about where Penn State stands with these 3 receivers and lay out your case for each one of them.
I said it earlier in the week, man. I truly believe that Penn State's going to get a really solid wide receiver haul this cycle. Might as well start locally with Lex Cyrus. He's down at Penn State and South Carolina. It has continued to sound good there for the Nittany Lions. He's been in decision mode since that South Carolina visit wrapped up. It doesn't sound like he's going to be on the board for too much longer. There's nothing concrete in that regard. But when it comes time for him to make a decision, Penn State sounds like it's in a good spot. Sounds like it's in a good spot with Jeff Exner too. 4-star wideout, teammates with Finny at McDonough. He's going to be at Maryland for an official visit this weekend, but all of the intel continues to point Penn State's way. And I feel really, really good about where the Nittany Lions are at with him. And with Matthew Allen, who is probably the top name on Penn State's board at wide receiver right now, depending on who you talk to. He has a ton of fans inside of Lash. Really, really talented wideout who has been a priority for Hagans since the winter. And he's going to be at Virginia Tech this weekend. And the Hokies have done a pretty good job with him. And I think that needs to be noted. But this just has the feeling of one that Penn State should win. He's been to Syracuse. He's been to Maryland. He's going to be in Blacksburg at Virginia Tech. You just have to like Penn State's odds, frankly, given the competition and the inroads that it has made with Allen throughout the cycle. So 3 wideouts I feel really, really good about with Penn State's chances. And I know that's been a huge talking point among the fan base. I think if Penn State's going to get that room turned around and upgraded with talent, this is the cycle to do so. And Marcus Hagans definitely has the Nittany Lions in position to cash in on the trail.
All right, we'll keep tabs on that, and what a haul that would be if all 3 end up jumping on board and joining Lyric Samuel in that wide receiver class. And we'll keep tabs, and maybe this weekend can help give some answers on who's next to join the class, because we got a few uncommitted recruits coming through. You already did a nice job laying out what's at stake, maybe with those safeties between Jadon Blair and Braswell Thomas out of South Jersey, who's really kind of reascended on the board for Penn State lately. But let's go down to Florida again. They just picked up a prospect from there, and you've got Seminole High School offensive lineman Max Buchanan, considered the number 41 overall interior offensive lineman nationally, heading up. He's right around 30 offers to his credit. He's going to take a closer look at Penn State. Can you bring us up to speed on where things are between Max Buchanan, Phil Troutwine, and the Nittany Lions?
The 2 sides, Buchanan, he's another one of those guys who hasn't come up a bunch in conversation, at least our conversation here. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that Zaire Addison and Michael Carroll and Goodman, who we already talked about, have been stealing the spotlight as top targets. Well, now Carroll's off the board to Alabama. Now Addison is off the board to Oregon. So Buchanan is going to be making it to campus for his official visit. And, Penn State's going to look to push and put itself in a good spot with him. He's been to Clemson. He's been to Florida State. He's been to Miami. Those are two really good in-state options for him. He's also been to UCF. That's another one that, allows him to stay a little bit closer to home if that's what he wishes to do. The relationship between Buchanan and Phil Charlton has been in a good place, but he hasn't been around. So he's going to have to get to campus, see everything, see how he meshes with the staff. We'll see how this one plays out. Again, I just want to reiterate that, Penn State's not going to make a move at offensive line unless it is 100% sold on a guy. Maury Hills is a good example of that, a guy who camped for the staff twice and, just didn't really do enough to have that offer become a committable one. But staff likes Buchanan, and they're going to get their chance with him this weekend.
Buchanan was a starting left tackle as a junior. He earned all area recognition down in Orlando, Florida. But we have him as listed as an interior offensive lineman. We have him listed at 6'4". Do we project him, if he were to join this class, as being an interior role guy?
Yeah, interior looks like the spot for him. He has the versatility and can play elsewhere, but interior seems like the spot for him.
All right. And I encourage people, if you missed the conversation on our last podcast, go check out the story that Tyler wrote about Owen Alicine, who got to campus here. You're looking for maybe the true tackle prospect in this class. It's clearly Owen at this point. And he caught up with you about Phil Trautwein coaching him up last weekend and his official visit experience. So check that out at Lions247.com. Give you a little bit more of a look into this offensive line group as currently constructed. Let's go over to the running back position. And I know some of our listeners are like, wait, hold on. There's 3 players committed at running back in Penn State's 2025 class. Why are we talking about this? Well, Philadelphia standout Jabri Wallace Coleman. He's taking a look around at several different schools, and he'll be back at Penn State this weekend out of Imhotep Institute. It's a familiar program. We just talked about Penn State adding its final 2 freshmen of the 2024 class to campus from there, and Tysier Denmark at receiver and Kenny Wosley at cornerback. And so what is the logic behind this in Jabri Wallace Coleman's standpoint and Penn State's standpoint? Because you and I discussed on Tuesday the fact that they had all 3 of those Penn State commits back in the nest for official visits last weekend. And as you noted, some monitoring to be had all the way through December with some of those guys, but they're all on board. So how is this going to work out?
Talented in-state guy at a program where, Penn State just signed 2 guys in Tysier Denmark and Kenny Wosley. So there's some good relationships in place at Imhotep. And Wallace has had interest in Penn State since backing off his commitment to Georgia, what feels like forever ago at this point. He's been around and, he has maintained that contact with the staff. So this isn't, some empty official visit. Penn State's going to get Wallace Coleman to campus. He's down to the Nittany Lions in North Carolina at this point. It seemed like Michigan State was in the running. He was actually slated to be in East Lansing for an official visit with the Spartans last weekend, but that wound up not happening. So really it's Penn State, North Carolina for Wallace Coleman right now. And you mentioned it with the 3 running backs on board. We still ultimately we're going to have to see what happens with Alvin Henderson still. Very much a touch and go thing. Even after, again, he said all the right things during his official visit. Sounds like he's locked in with Penn State. The commits feel that he's locked in, but one of those things where you're going to have to wait and see what plays out throughout the cycle. So, there's a bunch that goes into maintaining contact with a guy like Wallace Coleman and getting him to campus for an official visit. So we're going to have to see what comes of this one.
Jabri Wallace Coleman, as a junior last year during Imhotep's unbeaten run to a state championship, he went over 1,500 rushing yards, 28 touchdowns. He averaged about 8 yards per carry on the season. I'm just trying to picture Penn State's commit list with 4 running backs listed on it. I'm picturing anybody's commit list with 4 running backs on it. How much, this is a difficult question for anybody but Jaywan Sider to answer, but how much is Penn State really walking the tightrope right now and trying not to alienate any of the guys they've had on board and not to make Jabri Wallace Coleman feel like this is feigned interest versus trying to keep those 3 happy and trying to get to the finish line with your best possible running back class?
I think all is good with the 3 who are on board right now. I think they understand the strategy and the philosophy that goes into hosting a guy like Wallace Coleman for an official visit. Because, again, he's a talented runner, and he would add value to your running back depth chart. A running back depth chart that might look really, really different at this time next year if Nick Singleton and Katron Allen go off to the NFL. So you want to stockpile talent in the room. We always talk about Penn State. If they see a guy they really, really like and the fit's there and they can add him and everything works, they will, because they want to promote competition across the depth chart and just really stockpile talent and bring in talented guys at their respective position. And Wallace Coleman fits that mold. So if he wants to, if everything goes well this weekend and he wants to get in, conversations are going to have to be had inside of Lash. So that's why I say, this is very much a wait and see weekend for a lot of the guys who are visiting, and that applies here.
Penn State has regularly signed 2 running backs per class. That's happened a bunch. It happened again this cycle. They're really high on Quentin Martin and his versatility. I've heard a story about that, what he might be able to do as a freshman, impacting games as a runner and a receiver out of the backfield. And then Corey Smith in more of a developmental phase right now, getting to campus just a couple of weeks ago. But 3 guys already on board. Another getting an official visit here. By the way, Wallace Coleman, number 38 running back in our national rankings at 24/7 Sports. He's a 3-star there. When you look at the industry composite, he is a 4-star. In fact, he's a top 200 overall recruit at 185 overall and number 12 at the running back position. Let's finish this list with a really fun name for folks out there. LeVar Arrington Jr. out of Charter Oak in California, making the trip to campus. He's considered the number 61 overall athlete, so positionless prospect in terms of 24/7 Sports eyes, or multi-position prospect, I should really say. What do we need to know about LeVar Arrington Jr.? Because I think everyone knows about his dad, former All-American, a number 2 overall pick in the NFL draft out of Penn State. Where is his son from a positional standpoint with Penn State? And how much is involved for this with the Nittany Lions beyond the fact that he's the son of a legend who once ruled with the program?
So a lot of programs that are involved with Arrington Jr. have recruited him as an edge. He's a linebacker for Penn State. I mentioned Allen, potentially wanting to get one more guy in this class at linebacker. Arrington fits that mold of what Penn State is looking for. So I think that given the way his official visit schedule has played out, he made it to UCLA first, was at Tennessee last weekend. Penn State is very much in this mix and has a chance. There's appeal, given who his father is and his history in Happy Valley. So there's appeal in that regard. He likes the staff. So it goes far beyond just him being some legacy prospect who wants to follow in his father's footsteps potentially. He likes the staff, likes the scheme. So we're going to have to see what comes of this weekend with him. But Penn State is in a good spot ahead of the official visit. There's competition on the West Coast with UCLA. There's competition in the SEC with Tennessee. But Arrington, he was back in town for that blue-white game in April, and he got some good time with the staff while he was on campus, and he'll get some more this weekend. Very, one of the more interesting visits of the weekend for sure.
Arrington Jr. racked up 12 sacks last season as a junior. He knows Happy Valley quite well. So does Dad. A chance to gain more perspective, maybe from a different kind of lens in the next a couple days here on campus. And we'll find out what comes of this 4th and final official visit weekend of June. It's Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. You'll have a bunch of reporting over at Lions247.com. We'll pick up the conversation with Tyler Calvaruso on an early podcast next week to break down what we're hearing, see if Penn State maybe added another commitment out of this. And I think we're going to have a lot more clarity coming out of June, Tyler, on where exactly Penn State's priorities lie, who we can maybe put on the back burner or kind of off the radar a little bit, and perhaps some other names that have ascended during the month of June. But it always feels like once you reach July, even if you don't get all those commitments and to provide that clarity, you start to get nuggets and you can follow the pieces along about where Penn State is truly focused, because it's time to buckle up for them. They're getting ready for preseason camp. They're getting ready to prepare for the season. So they want to get a situation where now midsummer, they're pretty dialed in on what their target board looks like at those different positions. They are comfortable with where things are stacked. They've already had a lot of conversations. They've already had a lot of in-person evaluation. Probably had a chance to meet the family by now if there's been an official visit. And so a lot of that homework has been done, and it's a chance for you to gather all the data you've collected and say, yeah, let's debate a guy. Let's debate where these guys stand on the board. And you come out of it, and maybe everybody gets to go on vacation with their families for a little bit. And when you resurface on campus in July, you can say, okay, we have a firm target board. We know everything about these guys. Let's go try to make it happen.
Yeah, official visit season, it always goes a really, really long way in shaping where your priorities fall beyond the summer, because either you're going to have a bunch of guys committed and on board. You mentioned Penn State already being at 16, the potential for definitely some more additions coming here soon, given some of the timelines that these guys are on. But once the dust settles from official visit season, once these guys wrap up their recruitments with commitments, then you can kind of take a step back, evaluate things, and see where you want to go in the fall with guys who are still out there. There's always the potential for to get guys on campus in the fall, late risers, in the senior season. We've seen that in recent cycles. Cam Wallace, Chim Diono. So Steph's always out there hunting for hidden gems. So there's a lot that goes into the post-official visit season. But, yeah, it definitely helps to provide some clarity and kind of create a sense of direction, I would say.
Penn State coaches will get one more opportunity to welcome a huge wave of prospects to campus here in the month of June. That's going to happen on Friday, getting underway in the morning all the way through the afternoon. Third straight Friday, and hopefully this one doesn't feature a lightning delay this time around. But we'll be out on the field following the action. A bunch of regional high school teams will be represented for the 7-on-7 tournament. Same goes for the lineman action. Tyler, we're still working to piece together what this group of prospects will look like, and we'll be tracking them down throughout Friday and providing live updates at Lions247.com. But if there's something you're particularly excited to see or someone you're particularly excited to see, what is it right now?
Definitely Tyler Merl. He's going to be back there with this Cumberland Valley team. He's going to be participating in the Big Man Challenge. Going to be doing some individual work with Phil Trotwine. So that's obviously always something that you really, really like to see out of these events, who the coaches prioritize in an individual setting, and Merrill's definitely going to be one. He's one of Penn State's key in-state targets in the 2026 class. Whitey Collier is another in-state guy from Newman Goretti in Philly who has an offer. Penn State sees him as an edge rusher at the next level, sees him adding some weight playing D-end, but he goes both ways for Newman Goretti, so he's not even quite sure what setting he's going to be in on Friday. He doesn't know if he's going to go both ways for Newman Goretti or if he's going to be working with Deion Barnes individually. But I'm definitely excited to see those two on Friday.
Yeah, Merrill's a guy we got a long look at last June during one of these big man challenges. Excited to see where his progression is. He was one of the earliest names to know in the state of Pennsylvania, really along with Kevin Brown out of Harrisburg on the offensive line class here in the state. Cumberland Valley, over 300 pounds, 6'5", number 112 overall nationally, and number 5 interior offensive line prospect in 24/7 Sports Assessment of that 2026 class. So we'll have updates on Merrill. Everybody else we get a chance to put cameras on during that Friday action in Happy Valley. Please follow it at Lions247.com. Again, we'll come up and address some of those takeaways on our first episode of the podcast next week. Tyler, really appreciate it. There's been a ton to go over. It feels like a little bit like Groundhog Day, or maybe we're in a hamster wheel with these weeks kind of shaping up the same over and over again, coming off an official visit, waiting for the next official visit. We're getting off that hamster wheel next week, but while we've been on it, it's been really cool to see the diligence of your work and not only what you do at Lions247.com for us, but coming on the podcast and being able to articulate what's happening in live time. So really appreciate it, man.
No, I appreciate you for having me, man. It's been fun. We're almost at the finish line, but it's been fun, and it's going to continue to be fun because you got these guys all popping, coming off their official visit slids. So definitely a lot more to come, and I recommend if you're listening, stay tuned because we always got more for you.
Well, I will see you on the field nice and early on Friday.
Yep, for sure, man.
We'll continue this episode with perspective on one of the new kids on the block in the Big Ten Conference. We've talked about a Big Ten territory. When you think about it, you think of those dark November days, maybe some snow in the air. But Penn State's going to get a different experience when they hit the road in October, head out to Los Angeles to take on the USC Trojans. A lot of history for both of these programs. They have some postseason clashes that are remembered fondly for different reasons by different fan bases, but we're going to get to know more about the 2024 version of USC, where they're at in this era under Lincoln Riley right now with one of our 24/7 Sports Network insiders. We turn to the West Coast now and get RJ Abadia, who covers USC for the 24/7 Sports Network. RJ, good to have you in, and as I told you before we recorded, welcome to the Big Ten.
This is great. This is Big Ten podcast number 1, so very historic. I hope both programs noted in their media guides. So yeah, I'm ready to roll. This is really kind of exciting now that it's actually starting to happen and it's not like a hypothetical anymore.
Yeah, that's where my head's at. I mean, we got Washington on the schedule. That matchup looks a little bit different than it did last January. Of course, UCLA is coming to Beaver Stadium. The Nittany Lions are going to avoid a really strong Oregon team this year. But I think when we look at those newcomers from the Pac-12, the USC matchup on the road mid-October really could set the stage for what this Penn State team does during the second half of the season. I'm curious, as we sit here in June, what is the general thought around USC, the program, the fan base about what they're about to do, bridging the gap into the Big Ten?
Well, I think it has exacerbated maybe the general impression of the program that they might have had anyway. And what I mean by that is really simple. I think Lincoln Riley has built the program up as far as it can go without being strong at the line of scrimmage. And it was pretty apparent by the end of last year that USC just wasn't strong enough at the line of scrimmage, specifically on the defensive line between the tackles. They just weren't, and they couldn't hold the point. And, for all football, but obviously even more so for Big Ten football and just the best college football, you have to be able to hold the point. You have to be strong inside between the tackles on defense, and then you have to be able to do it on offense as well. And I think the whole focus of the offseason, both in word and in deed from Lincoln Riley, has been, we got to get bigger. We got to get stronger. The new Danton Lynn, the new defensive coordinator that they brought in, singing the same tune from the moment he arrived. So it's been a situation where I think SC fans are as optimistic as they can be without seeing USC truly upgrade at the places where they really need to upgrade. And that's an ongoing process, and that's something that they need to address sooner rather than later, especially with the move to the Big Ten.
They made that move to bring in Lynn from across the town. He was UCLA's defensive coordinator last year. That was a real bright spot for the Bruins, that side of the ball last fall. Folks around here know Lynn because he used to play for Penn State. And I think he's generally always been on kind of our hot board list for some position coach jobs back in the day, and more recently defensive coordinator jobs. So people know about Lynn. How notable was the move to fire Alex Grinch last year as defensive coordinator in early November, and then to make a pretty splashy hire in getting Lynn, who was really a rising star, a rising mind on the defensive side?
It was really notable for a couple reasons. I think the number one reason that it was notable is that it was a clear sign that Lincoln Riley realized, it's that old definition of insanity, right? You can't just keep doing the same thing over and over again and thinking you're going to get a different result. And it was, I believe it was truly difficult for Lincoln Riley on a number of fronts. I think one of the fronts is that Mike Leach coaching tree is a very tight fraternity. And I think, number one, he didn't want to get rid of Alex Grinch. And I think he just didn't want to have to do that. He didn't want to have to make that choice. So, moving forward, I think it was an impressive sign of growth that, he was willing to do something really uncomfortable that he didn't really want to do, because bottom line is the results weren't there. He defended Alex Grinch for pretty much the entirety of the two seasons. And he doubled down after season one when the defensive results were not great. And the defense was, equally poor in year two. And so to make a change was significant, and for Lincoln Riley. And again, they've made a lot of changes within the program. It's not just a situation where let's just bring in a wizard of a defensive coordinator and the magic wand will show up and we'll all be good. There's an understanding that this has to be built from the ground up and it has to be changed from the ground up. So it was really significant. And then to get a guy as good as Danton Lynn was fantastic. That's about as good as you can hope to get. He is extremely highly regarded, both in the college ranks, and I've talked to some pro people who are already kind of noting him and keeping an eye on him as a future NFL, both coordinator and head coach. So he's a rising star. I don't think there's any question about that. And for him to have come into UCLA, and UCLA did have some defensive talent, to make no mistake, but for him to come in and to bring about the transformation in a single season was really impressive. So yeah, I mean, the Danton Lynn aspect of it was incredibly significant for USC.
Lynn, just 34 years old. He's a guy who came out of Penn State as an undrafted free agent in 2012 and been really a career to track in college football, as we just heard. Let's focus on Lincoln Riley because let's be honest, you get 2 years of Caleb Williams and you got a lot of hardware trophies. Williams ends up being the number one pick. So Lincoln Riley has yet another feather in his cap as a quarterback mentor. But the win-loss record last year was one of the more puzzling results across the national stage. 8-5 record, 5 losses in the regular season. I don't think Lincoln Riley had ever suffered more than 2 losses in the regular season as a head coach at USC or Oklahoma. So you followed up with a bowl win to get to 8-5, but you say goodbye to the top quarterback in the country, and you're kind of making this dramatic move from a conference that's perceived as pretty weak to a conference that's perceived as very strong.
Yep.
How much is Lincoln Riley in the crosshairs as a prove it moment for him right now to validate obviously a lot of fanfare that involved him making the move from Oklahoma.
I don't think we're at crosshairs yet,
Mm-hmm.
but we are at crossroads in the sense that, I think it's a lot of kind of what I already just said, just in the sense that I think USC had reached the ceiling and Lincoln Riley had reached the ceiling. How far can an elite offense take a horrible defense? And in year one, there were some mitigating circumstances, not the least of which was USC had a massive turnover differential in their favor. They never turned the ball over, and the USC defense, they weren't able to get stops, but they were able to get turnovers. Not the traditional 3 and 4 down stops, but they got a lot of turnovers, and that cleaned up a lot. And so that year one is really more of the mirage than year two was, if you just look at the personnel. I mean, in year two, the offense was still, I think, number 6 points per drive. It was elite. They scored, and there's some stat too. I don't have the exact, but I think pretty much all but 1 or 2 of Caleb Williams' losses came with the opponents scoring over 40 points. So it was pretty clear what happened and what had to change. And so, I think for Lincoln Riley, again, he has recognized the change. He has not been stubborn about this at all. And he's been willing to come in and let Danton Lynn and the rest of the guys on that defensive staff come in and kind of have their say about how practice is supposed to look, about what conditioning, what needs to happen in the weight room, all that kind of stuff. So, the jury's still out. That as everyone knows, there's only 12 results that everybody cares about, and that starts September 1st for USC. But as far as recognizing the problem, admitting there's a problem, he's doing it, and this is kind of the moment for him, I think, because we're 7 years in. Everybody knows he's going to put points up on the board. I think you mentioned that Holiday Bowl. They were led by a first-time starter. A very good first-time starter, but a host of young talent, and they put up 42 points. And it wasn't a miraculous 42 points. It was just looked like Lincoln Riley's offense. So I think the brand is everyone knows he can do that, but the bottom line is, can he put a respectable defense on the field? Because if he can, that's the next step. That's where USC gets back up to that elite tier in college football.
55-10 at Oklahoma through those 5 seasons there, 2 campaigns in Southern Cal, 19-8 record for Lincoln Riley. And you mentioned a couple of things there, big themes for the offseason for USC as they make the leap to the Big Ten. The defense and how quickly can you get that up to speed, get that firing on all cylinders, and then in the trenches, the offensive line, their ability to get the push, to protect the quarterback, to develop the run game. And then I look at the schedule, and I think, man, USC has to accomplish a lot between now and kickoff. They open up against LSU in a primetime Sunday night matchup with all the country watching. They get Utah State at home for their and so that's a little bit of a reprieve. And then they go to Michigan. And then they host Wisconsin. And then they go to Minnesota, which is a tricky place to play, especially if you're new to the Big Ten. And then they host Penn State. So tell me how you marry those two things. The fact that USC has a lot of work seemingly to do this all season, and the fact that they have probably the most difficult landing pad in college football, as far as I can tell, with that 6-game slate to open things out.
Yeah, we've looked a lot into that schedule, and I've actually written a lot about it just even this week. And the interesting thing is, I think there's 2 big takeaways. Number one, aside from Utah State, who's not atrocious, by the way, and it will be coming off a short week because they do play on Sunday, and then they're back for Saturday to play Utah State at home. But there just aren't a lot of cupcakes and safe landing spots on that schedule. A 5-7 team is not a great team, but they're also not just going to roll over for you, right? And the sneaky thing is, if you look at the schedule too, the home games after the road games, to come back from Minnesota and you've got Penn State at home. I think they come back from a Rutgers trip and they've got Nebraska, who had a top 10 defense last year, and they're returning guys. So there aren't a lot of breaks on that schedule. And I think USC fans are realistic. I think they're not sitting there saying it's Big Ten title or bust. It's playoff or bust, even though obviously with a 12-team field, everyone's a little more optimistic. I think, again, it kind of just goes back to this season being about the level of play. Like, can Lincoln Riley put a decent defense on the field and a strong offense? Because if he can do that, I think for this season, USC fans will live with a wider range of win-losses that they consider acceptable. It's about putting out a level of play because, as you said, with that schedule, USC could be a really good team and lose 4 games. It's not crazy. It's not, it's not beyond the pale, right? And it's kind of an inverse of last year's schedule because the one thing I will say about this year's schedule is if you look at it, I think they have an October 19th game at Rutgers. And at that point, they never leave Los Angeles, but for one time. So from October 20, when they return from Rutgers through the regular season, the rest of the regular season, they don't leave Los Angeles except once, and that's to go to Seattle to play Washington. So it's kind of this thing where, man, if you just find a way to survive that first half, it's also pretty plausible that schedule helps them on the back end.
I think it's a road trip to Maryland, only because I'm a Rutgers alum, and I've had people complaining to me about the 11 p.m. Eastern time kickoff for folks in New Jersey. So that's why I know that's kind of hardwired. But you're right. You look at the schedule, and they have a trip to Maryland on October 19th, and then their road games are West Coast. They got Washington and they got UCLA. And I didn't even pick this up when I was breaking down the schedule earlier, but they bookend their inaugural Big Ten schedule with LSU and Notre Dame. So what exactly is a realistic win total that they can get to and hang their hat on? I know you say a lot of it depends on what's going on from a style standpoint, but we're talking wins and losses, what kind of bowl tier you might be involved in. What do you think would be acceptable and perhaps perceived as a step in the right direction for Lincoln Riley in year 3, wins-wise through those 12 games?
I think 8 and above would leave the fan base pretty excited about 2025. I think you get into a 7-win season, that's more about how did those games go, right? Like if it's a 7-win season and it's the usual 45-42 wins and 45-42 losses, I think there's going to be a problem. I think there's going to be some concern. If it's a little bit more conventional, if there's better defense played, if the product on the field looks better, and look, it's tough schedules. They're going to be playing a lot of close games. I think that is the safest prediction about USC right now. You look at LSU, like you said, LSU, Michigan, Penn State, teams with good defenses who aren't great, like Nebraska, Wisconsin. Nobody knows what UCLA is going to look like, but they're going to play UCLA. They're going to play Washington. Nobody knows what they're going to look like. So, I think it's so much more about the look of it all. But bottom lining it for you, I think 6-6. It's gonna be tough to feel great about that. 7 is murky, and anything from 8 on, I think you got to feel pretty strong about where they're headed.
10 games between these two programs in history. USC has a 6-4 advantage. Penn State cobbled together a 3-game win streak in the early 90s. Their last win in this series, 1996 in the Meadowlands. The last 3 matchups have gone USC's direction, including a couple in the Rose Bowl. Of course, these teams met the year that Penn State fell just shy of the college football playoff after winning the Big Ten championship, went out a thrilling 52-49 victory for the Trojans that got away from Penn State late. So I'm wondering, in terms of excitement for this Big Ten schedule, I guess specifically on the home schedule, because you got the road game in Ann Arbor at the defending champions in Michigan, but the home slate for USC in the Big Ten, Wisconsin, Penn State, Rutgers, Nebraska. No disrespect to Wisconsin and their history in the Big Ten, but they're not where Penn State is right now. They have not been where Penn State has been at. So how much is this a game that folks are already circling on their calendar for really mattering to this USC campaign?
I mean, I think it'll be more and more as the season comes together. I think it's a situation where, Penn State's kind of an interesting program right now, right? Because it's one of those things where they've run up against a bit of a ceiling over the last couple of years. They've built up a pretty strong, a pretty consistent program that is pretty good and wins a lot of games. And there's just this one hurdle, 2 hurdles specifically, if you're talking about opponents, that they just can't get past. So there are some similarities, I think, in the perspectives of the fan bases. So I think the Penn State game, I think it tracks as a pretty big game. It's a high-profile program. It's 2 high-profile programs. They're pedigreed programs. Everybody remembers that last Rose Bowl. It was a phenomenal college football game. I wasn't even covering USC, and I don't think you have to be a USC or a Penn State fan to appreciate how spectacular that game was. So
Saquon Barkley's coming out party for a lot of people. Sam Darnold made himself some cash during that matchup.
It was the best of college football. I mean, it really was. It was just a fantastic day in the best setting that there is. So, I think there's some excitement for that particular game, and I also just think that every week that we get closer to it, I think that's going to be a big thing. And I would imagine it's certainly been circled by Penn State fans as a travel destination.
Oh, yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, when you can go out to Los Angeles instead of Minneapolis for a Big Ten road game, that's not too bad. I want to ask you, when you lose a Heisman Trophy winner, #1 draft pick, the face of the franchise like that, and Caleb Williams, you wonder what the future looks like at quarterback. You teased it a bit in talking about that Holiday Bowl performance the offense put up. What does it look like behind center as this team approaches preseason camp?
I think among the many questions about this team, I actually think quarterback is barely one at all, to be honest with you. I think in Miller Moss, you have a player who's now been in Lincoln Riley's system for 2 years. This will be his 3rd year in the system. And there were no shortage of observers. I mean, Caleb Williams is Caleb Williams, and it's kind of a theme of our conversation, right? It's not necessarily the results, but the way he gets to the results. Nobody's going to get those results the way he got those results. So I think the hope and the expectation is that USC is still going to be a strong and elite offense. It's just not going to look like what it did with Caleb Williams. And Lincoln Riley had an interesting perspective on it during the spring. When you look at Miller Moss, you see a lot of strengths that deviate a little bit from Caleb Williams. He obviously isn't the athlete, because who is? But if you talk about, pocket presence, poise, timing, the ball coming out on time, the ball coming out on target, Lincoln Riley brought up the point that when you are integrating a young group of receivers, that kind of stability is actually a blessing, as opposed to having to ad lib and improvise and figure out what's going on back there. Where's the ball? What's our quarterback doing? How many guys are chasing him? You want veterans to kind of be able to do that. So, I think the offense will not look the same, but expectations at quarterback are that Lincoln Riley and Miller Moss are going to put points up. I think that's a safe thing to say at this point.
Who are you saying is a star quality player on both sides of the ball? Guys that by the time we get to mid-October, you think will have done a lot of damage and will be marquee names in this matchup?
That's a great question. I think, if you're looking at the defense, my optimism increases the further away you get from the ball. I really like the guys that they brought in from the secondary perspective. I think Kamari Ramsey is an all-conference type of a player. I think he could become more of a household name. Defensively, I think there's some young talent on the edges, guys like Cameron Fountain, that I think could become names or could flash by the end of the season. Offensively, I would say a name I'd go with is Mekhi Lemon. And it's hard to call him off under the radar guy, because I'm pretty sure he was a 5-star as a recruit. But amongst this stable of young USC receivers, he's kind of been under the radar during his first year, but he is a really solid player. And everything I've heard from PRPs and just the way he works in the offseason and what he was able to do in the Holiday Bowl, I think he's going to be a name that people know. I also think Jacoby Lane as a wide receiver is a guy who could be that next great, really prolific USC receiver. So those are the guys I think if you're excluding Miller Moss. I mean, I think when you're the quarterback, everybody kind of already knows your name, but I think those guys are the guys who would be the safest bets to kind of get everybody's attention over the course of the year.
Got one more for you, RJ. We're both kind of on that collision course now towards preseason camp. The countdown clock's starting to tick. Under 6 weeks now here in Happy Valley out there in Los Angeles. If you had to pinpoint one storyline that maybe you haven't addressed here in the first 20 minutes of this conversation that you think could really be central to USC's success, and you're curious how it develops during the month of August, what is that?
I'm going to go with the least exciting thing that everybody wants to talk about, but the one that has honestly cost USC more than given credit for, and that's special teams. I think that the focus was just all on the defense, justifiably so, in the winter off season. But USC brought in a long snapper. I think they brought in some kicking competition. They brought in some punting competition. They've got Zachariah Branch, who was an All-American as a returner last year, to kind of work on that end of it. But again, if you think your team's going to be playing in a lot of close games, which I think USC will be, that third phase, it's not just making plays, but it's also kind of avoiding disaster and being solid and not handing away yards and not having away big chunks and points. So if one of my first questions to Lincoln Riley will be, what do you feel about the special teams and how much of a priority are they going to get in training camp? Because, he doesn't have a dedicated special teams coach, and he's kind of given that vibe that, yeah, you got to do it. You got to pay attention to it, but it's clearly not a high priority when he plans out practices and stuff. And they've paid for it a little bit over these 2 years. So I'm just curious to know where they think they're going to get the most improvement and just how much of a priority it is in fall camp. Because like I said, you're looking for every advantage when you're playing a schedule like this, and they can't be deficient in the third phase if they're going to get through this season.
RJ Abadia covers USC for 24/7 Sports. We'll look to get him back on as we get closer to that October 12th showdown between Penn State and USC. As I said, welcome to the Big Ten Conference. However we can help you from Happy Valley and your coverage, we'll do that. But nice to get you on the pod.
Thanks for having me. Anytime.
All right, great stuff from a new Big Ten colleague here. It's going to be fun to get to know some of these guys out in Indianapolis. We'll be making a trip out to the Big Ten Media Days later on this summer in July. So chance to get some of these USC, UCLA, Washington, Oregon writers out with us and some of the traditional Big Ten programs out as well for our coverage. So you'll be hearing more from those new reporters right here on the Lions 24/7 podcast. 3 of those former Pac-12 programs will be on Penn State's schedule here in 2024. For now, stepping aside, big thanks before RJ to Tyler Calvaruso for breaking down the weekend recruiting landscape. We'll be on the fields all day Friday, get our live coverage of Penn State's final 7-on-7 tournament and Big Man Challenge of the summer over at Lions247.com. We're back with a couple more episodes next week right here on the Lions 24/7 podcast.